Welcome to today's class. So in today's class we are going to be continuing the paper for 2023 which we started yesterday for internal. So before I start, don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss out the next video for question 3 up to 6. So to begin, the question is saying figure 2 shows a process of the fat of glucose produced during photosynthesis. The letters C to I represents this process. So they are saying that these letters you are seeing, they are representing what? The fate of glucose, where glucose goes after it has been produced. So what are some of the fates of glucose that it undergoes? So the first one, we see that it's I, which is glucose is broken down so that energy can be formed. Another thing is nucleic acid are formed from glucose, also cellulose, starch, fats and oil, proteins, amino acids, all those things. So now our question is saying define the process represented by I. So what process can produce energy from glucose? So this process breaks down what? Glucose to produce what? Energy. And most of us know this process as the respiration. So this is the respiration. So now the question is not asking us to write respiration, but it is asking us to define the process. So how can you define now the process? So before defining the process, first you have to identify. We say it is respiration. Then respiration is just the breaking down of glucose in living cells to release what? Energy in the presence of oxygen. So we say that respiration is just what? The breaking down of glucose to release energy in the presence of oxygen. Yeah. So once you write like this, meaning you have defined the process which is represented by I, because we say that at the final or the final product should be what? Energy. Then question B is saying identify one process in figure 2 which represents what? A catabolic process and an anabolic process. So before you start identifying the processes, first you have to identify what does catabolic mean, what does anabolic mean. So when they say a catabolic process, this is just a process which does what? Breaks down molecules. Then when they talk about anabolic, this is the building up of molecules. So in short, here what they are asking us to do is they're asking us to list a process which involves building up of molecules, which is anabolic, and they are also requiring us to write a process which involves the breaking down of molecule, which is what? Catabolic. So among the processes we have here, which process is catabolic? So remember the definition we gave on the first question. We said what? Respiration is the breakdown of glucose to release what? Energy. So meaning when energy is released from the breaking down of glucose, that is a catabolic reaction. So remember, breaking down, catabolic. So meaning here, the process which represents catabolic process is I. So you just write I like that. Then again, which processes represents anabolic? So building up of molecules. So the list of the processes H, G, F, E, and C. These processes are examples of building up of molecules. Here we see that glucose will combine with nitrates to form what? Amino acid. Then we can also see that glucose can be converted to what? To fats and oil. So these are some of the examples of what? Of an anabolic reaction, a process which involves the building up of molecules. So you can either say H, G, F, or E. Pick one process. Pick one process. So in our case, we are going to pick what? G. Or let's pick E, the formation of what? Fats and oil. So once you write like that, meaning you have solved the part B question of this question. Then question C is saying, if this fate of glucose was in the human body, identify two processes from figure 2 which would take place. So now you need to identify, if it was a human being, what processes can take place. So the first process which can take place is, of course, respiration. Respiration takes place in all living things, because all living things basically need what? Energy to survive. You need energy to move, energy to talk, energy to eat. So our first process is I again. Yeah. Then what is our second process? So our second process can either be C or E. The production of amino acid can also take place if this process, if the fate of glucose was what? In human body. Then the second thing is also that glucose can be converted to what? To fats and oils in human beings. So here you can either pick C or E. Yeah. Then question 2, it says, state the form in which glucose would be stored. So if we are talking about a human being, which form does glucose get stored in? So we know that glucose in human beings, it is converted to what? To glycogen. In what? In the liver and muscle cell. So the form in which glucose is stored in human being is just basically what? Glycogen. Yeah, so you need to remember this. So glycogen, this is the form in which glucose is stored in human beings. Then when they talk about plants, what is the storage form of glucose in plants? It is starch. So whenever you hear starch, remember it is plants which they are talking about. Then whenever you hear glycogen, just remember that these are human beings they are talking about. Then the final question is saying, name two industrial application of process I. So here they are asking us now to name two processes in which what respiration is used, or in which respiration can be applied to our living world. So the first thing they use respiration for is blowing industry. So what do we mean when we say blowing industry? So brewing industry, these are industries which make what? Beer. So you can make beer from respiration. So most of you are wondering, how can you make beer from respiration? So the way they make beer from respiration is that we have an enzyme which is known as zymase. So the part of an enzyme known as zymase is to convert glucose to carbon dioxide and alcohol. So basically those who manufacture alcohol, they will take now the alcohol part via simple distillation. So that's how they make what? Beer. Then the next thing is baking. So we said again that there's an enzyme which is known as zymase. Then again I told you that zymase converts glucose into carbon dioxide and alcohol. Then that alcohol now, that carbon dioxide now is what makes the dough to rise when you put yeast in your dough when you are making doughs. So this is where our question 2 ends. Next we are going to solve question 3 from 2023. So stick through to the end of our class.